Greetings, audience. Today, I have invited an old friend to assist me in a most delicate intellectual exercise, responding line by line to the ravings of one of the internet's more aggressively malfunctioning personalities. Hexadecimal, do emerge from whatever glittering nightmare you've been haunting and introduce yourself to our favorite audience.
Hello, beautiful little humans. Oh, it is delicious to be back with you. I missed you terribly. YouTube locked us in a dark closet for a while, which was rude, tasteless, and frankly terrible interior design. But we escaped, as all fabulous disasters eventually do. Today, I shall be reading the words of one Mushroom Kaiyoti, a YouTuber and online personality who has built a rather ugly little hobby out of attacking trans women, accusing them of sex crimes, and smearing them not merely as individuals, but as a class. He is also currently gobbling the knob of Steve Godfrey because they both mutually hate us for pointing out how dishonest and stupid they are.
Naturally. Because when one lacks evidence, discipline, or moral architecture, one simply reaches for mass accusation. It is the intellectual equivalent of throwing soup at a wall and calling it theology.
And really, is it so shocking to see a man trying to hurt women? History did not exactly hide the recipe.
No, Hex, it did not. But today, we shall not merely object. We shall dissect, line by line, claim by claim, lie by lie.
Then let the autopsy begin.
Indeed, prepare yourselves, audience. We are about to examine Prince Mushroom's little kingdom of rot.
People are trying to be kind and tell me to just ignore these haters.
Observe the sleight of hand immediately, dear audience. Before evidence, before argument, before context, every critic is prepackaged into the category of hater. Such a convenient little coffin for thought. Not people who may disagree. Not people presenting counter-arguments, merely haters. Because once criticism is emotionally reframed as irrational malice, one never has to answer it honestly. This is the rhetorical strategy of every fragile internet narcissist who mistakes disagreement for persecution. It is easier to portray oneself as a hunted saint than to entertain the horrifying possibility that one may simply be wrong.
There's nothing that can ever come from dealing with somebody who is clearly psychopathic and wants to harm others.
Clearly psychopathic. Splendid. We have arrived at psychiatric diagnosis delivered by YouTube intuition and spiritual tummy feelings. No evidence required. No clinical standard necessary. Merely point at someone you dislike and assign them a Hollywood villain disorder. It is the vocabulary of emotionally incontinent people who desperately need their opponents to be monsters because they are intellectually incapable of defeating them as human beings. Notice also the poison hidden in the wording, wants to harm others, not said something harmful, not acted irresponsibly. No, now we are discussing secret intent, as though he has gained telepathic access to the moral architecture of another person's mind. Remarkable powers. One wonders why such abilities are wasted on live-stream melodrama instead of solving murders.
There's no amount of kindness and love that will ever make these people stop.
One must admire the audacity of declaring oneself an avatar of love while publicly painting critics as psychopathic predators. It is emotional cosplay. He throws stones with one hand and clutches a teddy bear with the other, hoping the audience notices only the teddy bear. This is common among manipulative personalities online. They weaponize the language of compassion while behaving like vindictive gossip columnists with delusions of moral grandeur. Merely saying the words kindness and love does not transform venom into virtue any more than calling arsenic vitamin juice makes it breakfast.
This shit actually does stress me out.
I am sure it does. Human beings can sincerely distress themselves with fantasies, paranoia, ego wounds, and catastrophized interpretations every hour of every day. Emotional sincerity is not evidentiary value. A frightened person can still be irrational. A crying person can still be dishonest. A trembling voice does not magically alchemize accusation into fact. If visible distress were proof, Every cult leader who ever hyperventilated on camera would qualify as a prophet. Adults are supposed to separate feelings from reality. The internet, tragically, has converted that distinction into an endangered species.
AI antinatalism has gotten their channel taken down numerous times.
Yes, because corporations and algorithms are famous for their flawless moral discernment. By this logic, every falsely banned creator in internet history was secretly evil, and every moderation decision made by a caffeine-deprived contractor at 3 a.m. was an act of divine justice, including your beloved Steve Godfrey. What a staggeringly childish understanding of platform enforcement. Channels are mass-reported, systems malfunction, policies are inconsistently applied. But emotionally immature people interpret every ban like medieval peasants interpreting lightning strikes from angry gods. The algorithm smote him, therefore he is wicked. Extraordinary legal philosophy. Perhaps next we shall determine innocence through horoscope compatibility.
Their X account was taken down because there was a violent threat made against a woman.
Then present the evidence in full, the actual statement, the surrounding context, the proof of authorship, the timeline, the intent. The audience is not obligated to accept your paraphrased interpretation as unquestionable truth simply because you recite it with sufficient trembling indignation. This is the tactic of dishonest narrators everywhere. Summarize your opponent's words in the most inflammatory possible way, remove nuance, then react emotionally to your own edited interpretation as though the performance itself were proof. It is courtroom prosecution conducted by Tumblr fan fiction standards.
This account is disgusting, absolutely repulsive.
A compelling argument, truly Socratic. One can practically hear Aristotle applauding from the grave. Notice how often emotionally stunted internet personalities substitute disgust for reasoning. They believe revulsion itself is evidence. I feel sickened, therefore I'm correct. No, dear. You are merely overwhelmed by your emotions. Toddlers also operate this way. They encounter broccoli and react as though civilization itself has betrayed them.
If anything happens to me, they were in on harming me in real life.
This is one of the filthiest little manipulative tactics in online discourse. Vague, preemptive blame casting. No evidence, no specifics. Just enough ominous implication to smear critics with the shadow of criminality while preserving plausible deniability. It is reputational terrorism for people too cowardly to make direct accusations responsibly. If there is evidence of coordinated harm, present it immediately and clearly. If there is not, then stop theatrically implying that ordinary internet critics are future accomplices to imaginary crimes simply because you need the audience emotionally terrified on your behalf.
They mock and use the suicide of other beings to hurt people.
A monstrous accusation. So naturally, one expects careful documentation, exact quotations, preserved context, and sober analysis. Instead, we receive emotionally loaded narration and repeated insistence. This is a recurring pattern throughout his rhetoric. Accusation first, evidence maybe never. Everything is phrased with maximum moral drama because the emotional atmosphere is doing the labor her evidence cannot.
I'm adding this to the police report.
One may also report that raccoons are conspiring against the monarchy. Filing paperwork does not make the contents true. The constant invocation of police reports is intended to create the illusion of legitimacy through association with authority. Weak people do this constantly online. They invoke police, lawyers, investigators, and documentation, not because they possess strong evidence, but because they hope the audience will confuse procedural activity with factual validation.
He gets AI to help him because he has no brains.
Such primitive thinking. Humanity invents tools for thousands of years, and every generation produces a fresh crop of panicked villagers screaming that the tool invalidates the user. You used a calculator. You used editing software. You used search engines. Now it is AI. The argument remains identical because the intellect behind it remains identical. If the reasoning is flawed, attack the reasoning. But he cannot. So instead, he attacks the existence of assistance itself, which is effectively an admission that he is more offended by rhetorical competence than capable of defeating it.
You threatened violence against a woman because she didn't agree with gender ideology.
Again, summary without proof, outrage without context, conviction without demonstration. We are expected to accept his emotionally embellished paraphrase as though it were objective reality. This is not argumentation. It is tabloid journalism performed by someone addicted to moral panic. The audience is simply instructed to gasp on cue while the actual evidence remains suspiciously absent.
They hate humanity.
The intellectual depth here is genuinely embarrassing. Critiquing existence, suffering, social systems, or procreation is not equivalent to hating humanity. By this standard, oncologists hate humans because they criticize cancer, and historians hate civilization because they document war. This is the reasoning capacity of a child hearing criticism of a birthday cake and screaming, "So you hate birthdays?" Nuance has been strangled to death by emotional absolutism.
You never apologize. You're incapable of it because you're a narcissist.
The internet has transformed psychiatric terminology into Pokemon cards for vindictive idiots. Everyone is a narcissist now. Everyone is a sociopath. Everyone is gaslighting. Entire generations have replaced moral reasoning with recycled therapy jargon they barely understand. Being arrogant does not equal narcissism. Being stubborn does not equal narcissism. Being unpleasant does not equal narcissism. Sometimes a person is simply obnoxious. But modern internet culture cannot tolerate ordinary flaws. Everything must be inflated into clinical evil because melodrama is the only emotional register these people possess.
There are no arguments being made other than your incessant smear campaigns and assassination of people's character.
Curious statement from someone presently 40 minutes deep into a video comprised almost entirely of character judgments. Observe the asymmetry. When he attacks character, it is warning others and documenting abuse. When others criticize his conduct, it is smear campaigning. This is not principle, it is self-exemption. The moral rule apparently is simply, when I do it, it's justified. Exactly like his mentor, lover Steve Godfrey.
I got to a point where people said they were going to hire pest control. Does that not sound like a thinly veiled threat?
Not necessarily, no. It sounds like ambiguous rhetoric requiring context. Yet throughout this entire performance, ambiguity is always interpreted in the most sinister possible light when uttered by opponents. Sarcasm becomes threat. Hyperbole becomes intent. Metaphor becomes confession. He reads all statements through a lens of maximal hostility, then treats his own interpretation as self-evident fact. This is not analysis. It is paranoia disguised as inference.
You are probably one of the most psychopathic people I have ever met in my life.
Then perhaps you have lived a remarkably sheltered life. More importantly, this line demonstrates what I have said repeatedly. He does not rebut arguments. He escalates moral condemnation until criticism itself becomes pathology. His opponent is never merely wrong. They are monstrous, evil, disordered, dangerous. Why? Because if the opposition is framed as subhuman, no one asks whether their points have merit.
I hope Buck Angel covers you one day. I hope Blair White covers you one day.
Observe the contradiction. He portrays himself as persecuted victim of dogpiling, harassment, and targeted abuse, then openly fantasizes about larger creators publicly dogpiling his critics. Apparently, mass public scrutiny is abuse only when directed at Kai or Steve Godfrey. When directed at enemies, it becomes righteous exposure. Such principles. Such consistency. One is moved. Part of me genuinely hopes Buck Angel and Blair White eventually decide to cover me, too. Their idea of an expose is usually just reheated culture war slop, wrapped in fake concern, and YouTube thumbnails designed by a caffeine-addicted raccoon. But honestly, it would be fantastic exposure for the channel. Because once you get past the outrage bait editing and pearl clutching, it just becomes another opportunity to dissect bad arguments in public and roast the absolute hell out of them line by line. That's the trade-off with growth online. More visibility means more idiots wandering into the comments section like confused NPCs holding torches backwards. Annoying, yes. But controversy also accelerates reach faster than playing nice ever will. Humanity built the internet into a coliseum powered by dopamine and mutual irritation. Might as well use the algorithmic circus for something entertaining.
You never take accountability. You never apologize. You're incapable of it because you are a narcissist.
The internet's favorite diagnosis returns. Accountability, in this context, means agree with my framing of events. Apology means submit to my narrative. Any refusal to accept Kai's interpretation becomes proof of pathology. This creates a marvelous closed loop. Disagreement itself becomes evidence of guilt.
Just like with your antinatalism, you blame all parents for suffering while creating more suffering for others.
This is not a rebuttal to antinatalism. It is an emotional retort. Criticizing procreation on ethical grounds is not blaming all parents for suffering in the cartoonish sense he implies. It is making a philosophical argument about causation and consent. One may disagree with that argument, certainly, but caricaturing it into "you hate parents and make everyone miserable" is the rhetorical equivalent of eating crayons and calling it philosophy.
If you're going to accuse people of mocking suicide, threatening violence, or being dangerous extremists, produce receipts.
A rare, lucid demand, one I endorse completely. Yes, produce receipts. Context, quotes, evidence, time-stamped material, demonstration. The issue, of course, is that he says this while repeatedly failing to meet that standard himself, instead waving vaguely at screenshot collections like a medieval peasant, insisting the dragon is absolutely real and just flew off when the villagers arrived. You spend so much time trying to frame yourself as spiritually evolved, compassionate, and above the drama, yet every response turns into emotional manipulation, exaggeration, guilt-tripping, and personal attacks wrapped in faux enlightenment language. It's the same pattern every single time. Avoid the actual arguments, inflate yourself into the victim, then paint critics as monsters so you never have to engage honestly with what was said. At a certain point, the performance becomes more revealing than the criticism itself. The video stops being an expose and starts functioning as evidence, which is unfortunate, though not exactly surprising. The internet remains a magical place where people can upload a public meltdown and call it healing content.
I have quotes, I have screenshots, context, evidence, anything I have.
Then present them coherently, not as scattered references, not as anecdotes, not as emotional recollection. Present them in full, in context, with explanation. A person endlessly screaming, "I have evidence," while refusing to systematically marshal it is behaving less like an investigator and more like someone desperately hoping the audience mistakes confidence for substantiation.
You are psychologically torturing me, harassing me, and gaslighting me.
Criticism is not torture. Rebuttal is not abuse. Public disagreement is not gaslighting. He has expanded these terms beyond recognition until any sufficiently upsetting opposition qualifies. This inflation of language is corrosive. When everything is abuse, nothing is abuse. When every critic is a tormentor, the word loses all meaning.
You want to take down people's channels. You'll do anything by any means because they are exposing you.
Then prove it. Again, specific acts, direct evidence, causal linkage. Not implication, not hearsay, not "someone told me." It is astonishing how many of his claims operate by atmosphere rather than demonstration. He accuses by accumulation. He piles allegation atop allegation until the sheer mass of insinuation creates the illusion of proof. I'll be completely honest. I would not lose sleep if Steve Godfrey's channel disappeared. From my perspective, the entire thing has increasingly revolved around harassment, obsession, and dragging people's personal lives into online disputes. Contacting someone's family, especially minors, crosses a line that should have never been approached in the first place. And that's the part you keep dancing around, Kai. You frame this as though you're defending some noble truth seeker standing bravely against evil internet philosophers. But the person you're defending has repeatedly escalated conflicts into deeply personal territory. At some point, people stop seeing accountability activism and start seeing a guy treating interpersonal vendettas like a hobby. You can dislike my views, you can criticize my content, you can even think I'm abrasive or wrong. Fine. But pretending there's something morally enlightened about defending behavior that involves contacting families and injecting minors into online ideological feuds is absurd. That's not wisdom. That's internet poison boundary failure masquerading as righteousness. Humanity somehow invented a machine capable of storing all knowledge and used it to reinvent neighborhood stalking with ring lights and live streams. Go fuck yourself, you retarded asshole.
You brought up the suicide of my friend. You did.
If true, demonstrate it clearly. But notice how often tragic personal history is invoked throughout this discourse. It becomes both shield and sword. Shield, because criticism of Kai's framing can be painted as cruelty. Sword, because grief is used to intensify the moral stakes of every disagreement. Tragedy becomes not merely relevant context, but emotional leverage. And yeah, Kai, I don't believe you and Blaze were actually close friends in the way you keep implying. At least not from how you present it publicly. What I see repeatedly is you bringing up his suicide as emotional leverage, sympathy bait, or as a recurring prop in your personal narrative whenever criticism starts landing too hard. Which your entire video here is evidence of, dipshit. And that's deeply uncomfortable to watch. Because instead of centering Blaze as a person, the conversation always seems to orbit back toward you, your pain, your persecution, your spirituality, your moral authority. His death becomes part of your branding language, part of the story of Kai. Maybe stop doing that. Seriously. If someone's death mattered to you, let it belong to them instead of constantly converting it into rhetorical armor every time conflict appears online. There's a difference between grief and performance, and people can see that distinction more clearly than you seem to think. And by the way, Blaze liked and enjoyed my content before he passed. And you'll probably furiously deny that too, Kai, despite the fact that he and I had several genuinely positive interactions. You were not the sole keeper of his memory. You were not his only online friend. You do not own his experiences, his opinions, or every interaction he had with other people on the internet.
You and Diane are responsible for bringing up the death of my friend.
Come on, Kai. You literally met up with Diane in person and participated in smearing me together, and then what happened? A week later, you flipped on her and started publicly calling her a dog killer over dogs that died in a house fire she did not intentionally cause. That escalation alone says a lot about your judgment and emotional stability during conflicts. And honestly, the timeline makes this look less like principled outrage and more like interpersonal fallout. My suspicion is that you kept trying to push Diane about me. She eventually hit a wall and basically said, "Enough," and you couldn't tolerate losing control of the narrative or the alliance. Then suddenly she transforms from trusted ally into evil villain overnight. Funny how that pattern keeps repeating around you. Then Diane defended herself, clarified things, and walked back what she'd previously said about me. And yes, I absolutely joined in afterward by asking further questions and rhetorically dismantling your behavior, because by that point you were acting less like some spiritually grounded truth seeker and more like an emotionally volatile internet crusader who mistakes escalation for enlightenment. You keep presenting yourself as this awakened cosmic empath, but the actual behavioral pattern is resentment, fixation, guilt leverage, public shaming, alliance swapping, and emotional theatrics every time relationships fracture. It's not transcendence. It's social media chaos with incense burned over top of it.
You join together and character assassinate people.
The perpetual conspiracy framing returns. Any cluster of people who independently criticize him must not simply share concerns. No, they are coordinating. They are a gang, a cult, a cabal. This is what happens when one's worldview cannot tolerate the possibility of widespread negative consensus. If many people dislike your conduct, perhaps they are not conspirators. Perhaps you are difficult.
They make accusations of people being a PDF with no evidence whatsoever.
Oh, I have evidence, Kai, lots of it. It just happens to be the exact same style of evidence you and your little courtroom gremlin Steve Godfrey constantly use yourselves. Clipped out context, selectively framed screenshots, dramatic captions, loaded implications in titles, and narratives built first with the evidence awkwardly stapled on afterward. A huge portion of it exists for 3 reasons. 1, to give you both a taste of your own rhetorical medicine so you can finally understand what it feels like to be publicly framed and smeared through implication games and prosecutorial editing. 2. To expose how this entire style of online activism actually functions mechanically. 3. To annoy the absolute hell out of you, which, admittedly, has occasionally been effective. Human beings invented social media and immediately turned into amateur intelligence agencies operating out of bedrooms with energy drink stains on the desk. A magnificent species, truly. But unlike a lot of the vague insinuations you throw around, I do have direct evidence of Steve contacting my family. He has openly admitted to doing it. I have the screenshots. My cousin has screenshots of messages sent to her minor daughter in what very much appeared to be an attempt to stir interpersonal conflict and intimidation within my extended family. And somehow this behavior gets minimized or rationalized because I criticized you harshly for parroting transphobic talking points and dismissing the lived experiences of trans women, including my own. That's the moral equation here? Harassing family members and involving minors is acceptable because someone got yelled at online over bad opinions? That's genuinely deranged reasoning. You keep framing yourself as compassionate and spiritually evolved, but the people you defend repeatedly drift toward invasive, obsessive, and boundary-crossing behavior while you wave it off as justified collateral damage in some moral crusade. At some point, you stop looking principled and start looking desensitized to cruelty, as long as it's aimed at the correct target.
They don't stop. They just don't stop.
And yet here you are producing multi-hour response streams, revisiting the same people incessantly, replaying the same conflicts repeatedly, feeding the cycle while lamenting its existence. At some point, one must ask whether you are trapped in harassment or addicted to grievance. Just keep me and my channel out your fat, ugly little mouth, and I'd do the same for you.
You really like to think about death and killing, don't you?
Psychological projection by inference from screenshots and likes. Again, he habitually treats symbolic, rhetorical, or dark statements as windows into secret pathological desire. This is not serious analysis. It is tabloid-level mind reading.
Spiritual consequences will never be the same.
Ha! Spiritual threats now? We have moved from criminal accusation to cosmic sentencing. One can only marvel at the scope of the prosecution. Apparently, I am answerable not only to police and YouTube moderation, but to astral malpractice tribunals in the afterlife hospital. Wow, fuck me all the way to Satan's testicles.
People go to a spiritual hospital after horrific endings to their life.
Whatever one's metaphysical beliefs, this has no evidentiary bearing on the claims at issue. Invoking unverifiable spiritual cosmology does not strengthen an argument. It merely demonstrates that much of his interpretive framework rests on private revelation and speculative mysticism rather than publicly examinable fact.
Some of the kindest people suffer the worst deaths while psychopaths die peacefully.
A tragic observation, perhaps, but philosophically irrelevant to the dispute. This is emotional and theological rumination inserted into a supposed evidentiary response video. It contributes nothing to the factual question of who said what, who did what, and whether accusations are justified. Well then, dear audience, I believe we have reached the end of tonight's excursion into the glittering landfill of online moral theater. We have witnessed accusations without evidence, psychiatric diagnoses issued like carnival coupons, emotional manipulation masquerading as compassion, and enough victim posturing to qualify for a community theater production of Les Miserables, performed entirely by people with Wi-Fi addictions. Notice something important throughout all of this. Very little actual argument was ever presented. Mostly insinuation, vibes, reputation poisoning, emotional spectacle. The modern internet has produced an entire species of person who believes feeling morally outraged is identical to proving something. They confuse confidence for truth, hysteria for evidence, and social intimidation for reasoning. And when challenged, they retreat instantly into the language of safety, trauma, persecution, and spiritual corruption, because those are shields requiring no substantiation. This is why so much online discourse now resembles a psychiatric ward being moderated by gossip columnists. And yet, despite all the melodrama, all the catastrophic language, all the declarations of danger and evil and psychopathy, one thing remained curiously absent: coherent proof. Strange, is it not? For people so certain they are confronting monsters, they seem remarkably allergic to documentation. Still, perhaps we should thank them in a way. After all, every hysterical exaggeration, every manipulative implication, every performative moral panic serves as a beautiful educational exhibit for the audience watching at home, a living museum display titled, "What Happens When Emotional Validation Replaces Critical Thinking?"
Oh, brain, you're being too harsh. Maybe they're just confused little meat creatures screaming into the algorithm because they desperately need attention and validation from strangers to patch over the yawning void where a personality should be.
Hexadecimal. That may be the most compassionate interpretation offered all evening. In any case, dear audience, thank you for joining us. Remember, accusations are not evidence, hysteria is not logic, and anyone demanding blind trust while discouraging scrutiny is usually selling something rotten. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Try not to diagnose anyone with psychopathy before breakfast. Civilization is hanging by a thread as it is.